Okay. Can everybody hear?
Yeah, we can
Indeed,
hear you, Rabbi.
Okay, great. So let us
I
begin.
hear you, but have the pleasure of seeing you.
Oh, thank you. Nice of you to say. Um, excuse me. Okay, so we're going to start a new topic tonight. Um, and that is, I mean, again, it's going to overlap with other things that we've done, which is good. And that is the Gemara on Gimel Amud Aleph. This should be New Mar Makomos. Did everybody receive the New Mar Makomos?
Yes,
Great.
7 page.
What? Yeah. So
Hi, Rabbi.
the Gemara can be found also in the New Mar Makomos, Talmud Bavli, starting from Gimel Amud Aleph to Gimel Amud Beis. But if you want to follow in the actual text of the Talmud, which is always more authentic, for those who have it, so it is. Let's see, I'll tell you exactly. It is 3, 6, 9, 12. It's like 14 lines up from the bottom of the page. You'll see there are two dots there and a little asterisk. Tani Rabchia. Yes. Those who are looking are able to find it.
And the Mara Makomot, where would that be?
Oh, in the Mar Makomos, it's right on page 1.
Oh,
Tani
okay.
Rabchia. You can follow it either way. Okay, so let me read the Gemara originally, and then we'll break. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but we'll right now. But let's start. Okay. So the Gemara says Tani Rabchia. Rabbi Chia um, came up with the following idea in the following case. It's Monoli biadecha. So again, let's say there are again two individuals, right? And let's say Ruvain and Shimon, right? So Ruvain says to Shimon, Monoli biadecha. Monoli biadecha means you are holding on to $100 that is mine, meaning you owe me Monoli biadecha. You have $100 that belongs to me. Let's say I lent you $100. The Halah, Omer, Shimon responds, and he says, two sides to every discussion, right, or to every argument. He says, Ein lecha biyadi klum. I owe you klum. Klum means nothing. But so normally, let's say if we had stopped right there, that is called kofer hakol. Kofer hakol means I accuse you of something or I demand something from you, and you respond by totally rejecting my claim. Kishmo kemu, kofer hakol. I deny it all. The wrinkle here is that
One second.
there are
I can't
adim,
get the volume on
but
on
I'm
my
sorry,
shear.
you can't hear?
Uh,
Are you okay?
yeah.
If somebody needs can everybody hear me?
Yes, I
Yes,
think
Rabbi,
was
we can hear you.
I
Okay,
think
great.
that was Andy trying to hear you.
Okay. Anyway, so the wrinkle here is that this normally a case of kofar hakol, we throw it out of court,
Can't hear anything.
meaning you've made your accusation, I've made my rebuttal. There's no evidence, so there's nothing to talk about. Now, had it been, this is what we're going to discuss in a moment, moda b'miktas, had I admitted part, so then I would be chayav a shvua doraisa. I would be obligated to take a biblical, as we discussed for the last number of weeks, for various reasons, there are three biblical oaths. There are three shvuos doraisa under the rubric of shvuos hadayanim, meaning in the context of civil legal disputes, there can be three shvuos doraisa. One is shvuos eid echad, a single witness, right, testifies that somebody owes money, has to respond to him, counter him by taking the shua daraisa. The other is moda b'miktas, if you admit not the whole amount, but you admit part. So the part that you admit, you have to pay, and the rest, The disputed part, that is subject to a shvua. And the third one is shvuas hashomrim, which is the oath that is given when there is some lack of clarity about what happened to an object. Like, I gave my object to somebody else to watch. Something happened to it and he can't return it to me. So that's called shvuas hashomrim. Anyway, these are the three shvuos d'oraisa as we've been discussing. So normally, in a case like this, where the guy says, "Mano li biadecha, you owe me $100," and the guy responds and says, "I don't owe you anything," that's called kofer hakol, denying it all. And normally we would just throw that on a deraisa level, I should explain. We would throw that out of court. We would say he doesn't owe him money and he doesn't owe him clarity through a shvua either. Now, midrabanan, I should add, this is the Gemara in Masachet Shavuos, and this is how we paskin. Midrabanan, on a rabbinic level, they instituted a shvua called shvuas heses, which I'm sure we've made mention of it, so you've all heard of it. Shvuas heses for a kofer hakol, but that's a din d'Rabbanan, and we will talk more about that in Mirz Hashem going forward. So, but this case is complicated by virtue of the fact that even though there's no moda b'miktzas, meaning it's the other fellow doesn't admit that he owes anything, he's kofer hakol. However, the ha'edim me'idim also sheyesh lo chamishim zuz. The witnesses show up in court and they say, we know something about this case. So if the witnesses had come and they said, we know that it's true that Shimon owes Ruvain $100, well, as we've said many times, witnesses are a gold standard. Unless they're contradicted by other witnesses, no baldavar, right? No protagonist, in a case can reject witnesses. Witnesses win. They're the gold standard. So if the witnesses had come and they had backed up the claim of $100, then that would be, a clear open and shut case of he'd have to pay the $100. But what happens here is that parallel to modem mixas, but this is chiyuv b'miktas, the Edom say, we know that he owes $50. Right? Now, you might think if the witnesses say he owes $50, then aren't they also saying that he doesn't owe $100? In which case the gold standard, is on the one hand obligating him to pay the 50, but that wouldn't trigger a shvua d'oraisa because on the other 50, which is what the shvua would address, that other 50.
Does that make the lender into a chakran?
Say again?
Does that make the lender into a chakran?
It makes the lender.
In other words, the lender.
So Kafran, correct. So,
I mean, the lender's credibility.
That isn't what happened here. That isn't what happened here. What happened was that if the Edom had come to court and they said he owes 50 and the other 50 he doesn't owe, then that's what
they only know about 50.
There would be a payment of 50, and that would be the end of the story.
They only know about.
That's not what happened. What happened was the Edom came to court and they said, we know for sure that he owes 50. As for the other 50, we have no knowledge about that. Okay.
And obviously there's been no indication as to whether it was given on one time or two times. Because it was given on one time, that would have.
It's not a very difficult. We saw bills, but what we saw amounted to 50. It could be that there was other, parts of the transaction became in the middle. Who knows? Whatever it is, it's not hard to envision a scenario where witnesses say we know a part of the claim is true without them saying that the other part is not true. They say just we don't know. We're not familiar. We'll soon see a very remarkable thing, and that is that according to the Rajba, this isn't even the case. It's a more complicated case. So
by the way, if these Edom are found to be Zomerman, what's their obligation?
Well, if the Edom are found to be Zomerman, then they would pay $50. Because what they're being mechayev is $50. Now they're also being mechayev a shvua, but there's no way, to when it comes to Azama, the principle is vasisem lo kasher zamam lasos le'achiv. But
Miktas,
what?
Bli knas, bli,
It's a kind of a knas. It's a kind of a
This
knas.
would be the case even if the $50 in a different situation was paid because he wasn't able or willing to swear. In other words, let's say they came.
Oh, so we'll get to that. We'll get to that. That meaning that's not the case that we're talking about in the Gemara, but we'll talk about such a case. The case of the Gemara is a straightforward one on the surface. For the Rambam, at least, it's a straightforward case, which is the accusation is you owe 100. The response of the other party is I owe 0. The witnesses come, they establish you owe 50. As for the rest, we don't know. So the chiddush of Reb Chia is again, of course he has to pay the 50 because there's evidence about that. The chiddush of Reb Chia is v'shava al hashar, just like motive b'miktsas, right? He admits 50, and on the other 50 he has to take a shvuah. So too in this case, the two witnesses, right, establish an obligation of 50, but they also establish that on the doubtful 50, remaining 50, that there's a chiyuv shvuah.
And the chiddush is that logically we would bifurcate this into two cases. In 50, he has to pay, and the rest is kofar kol. That's a chiddush of Rav Chia, that we're not saying that.
1 second, I'm just going to make my thing a little louder. I'm having trouble hearing you. 1 second. Just 1 second. Okay, say that again.
Is the chiddush of Rav Chia that he would say we should bifurcate this case? One part of it is Adam Kom Yo 50. The other part you kofar kol, so you shouldn't have to swear. Is that?
No, that's more like what we call halach. Yeah, no, I think the chiddush is,
or it's halach, as you were going to say. I think.
Yeah, that would be halach. But I think the chiddush is more simple, and that is what we know from biblical law, and which is accepted, is moda b'miktsas. And moda b'miktsas means that he admits half, and and therefore.
So he denied everything. He still denies everything.
Right. But here he doesn't. He's kofar kol. He doesn't admit anything. So it's really chiyuv. What we're trying to substitute in a way is chiyuv miktsas for moda b'miktsas. Now again, this is the way law sometimes is. Maybe the argument is the argument. Well, we'll see in a moment. The argument. Well, okay.
Well, the understanding we used to say way back when, even in grade school, is the reason for moda b'miktsas was because once he missed something, then we see something is not 100% kosher. We could apply that same thing to the Adam. Once the Adam say that it's true that there's $50 was owed, then we say something is not right. So therefore, he should fall into the same category as a moda.
Well, instead of saying right, I mean that is that, and that's not just in grade school. So there's something to that. Meaning, what you're saying, Tosas on Dalid Amud Aleph, I'll read it to you in just a second, calls that a taina chashuva. And that's going to be part of our discussion this evening. Meaning what Tosas says is, if I accuse you of, owing me $100, and you say, I never met you before, or I paid you back, I mean, I don't owe you a penny. So it's my word against your word. And basically the person who's accused is basically not corroborating any part of the claim. And therefore it's easy to dismiss it. It's it's just what we call a taina bialma. However, if miktsas of the claim, if yesh dvarim bego, meaning if part of the original claim, is authenticated, so then it's called, they'll use the language of Tosas, a taina chashuva. That gives extra status and makes more likely. It gives added credibility to the person who's making the claim. Added credibility to the claim itself. I'll just read you the line.
Is that like yesh raglayim l'davar comment?
Yeah. So the Ramban, by the way, uses in a number of places, including here in Bava Metzia, but also in Shavuos, Mem Beis Amud Beis, and Gittin, Nun Aleph Amud Beis. The Ramban often uses the expression raglayim l'davar, what you just did. Which means, there's something to his claim. Yesh raglayim l'davar. The language of Torah.
what is
This one's, yeah.
המוציא מחברו עליו הראייה? Why
Yeah.
don't we use that?
Well, we do. In the case, that's why kofar hakol is potter.
Uh-huh.
But in this case, he remember whether it's modem and mixas or this rabchia, right? Here there is let's say this case, the fellow accused him. He said you owe me 100, and the guy said I owe 0. If it had ended right, if that was the end of the evidence, then you'd say motzim mecharer levaraya. However, the problem is that then 2 witnesses show up in court, and that is raya, and they say he owes 50. Now, what remains is, what about the other 50? Now, the witnesses are not backing him up and they're not contradicting him. But what they've done is, they have created raglayim l'davar or taina chashuva, right? And that's why it triggers a shchi of shvua doraisa. It doesn't trigger money because that's still motzim mechaver levaraya, right? On the 50 that he admits, in the case of modim mixas, or the 50 that the Adim come and back him up in the case of Rabbi, that's not a problem of motzim mechaver levaraya because that's evidence. But as far as the other 50 is concerned, it's kind of like gray area, like a limbo in between. You know what I'm saying? It's not like kofar hakol. We could just say, anybody could, as we know, like we live in a, living in a world, which has its issues, is not new for Jews or mankind. As long as man has, walked the face of the earth, he some of them are, not all of them are, noble and God fearing. So people try to get ahead. People take advantage. So imagine if this is what the Ramban says when he says raglayim l'davar. By the way, he says, otherwise every person, every dishonest person could impose shvuos on people. And some people don't want to take a shua because they're queasy. They don't want to go to court, hold a sefer Torah, use Shem Hashem, to say I don't owe $5. You know what I'm saying? So maybe they'll pay. The Ramban says we don't want to encourage. By the way, when the Ramban says that, just to make it clear, he's not saying, in principle, you should be able to do this. However, it's like a takana or a siag, daraisa. He's more explaining why the Torah itself, would not think that you have to respond to every single claim that people make, but you should respond when there's a raglayim l'davar or when it's a taina chashuva. There's not, and these are just different ways. I'm just going to read you the language of, if those of you who have a Gemara in front of you.
Yes, I do.
Because I did not put this on the sources, although I should have.
Where is it, Rabbi? What daf?
Look on, just turn a page, Daled Omid Aleph, for a minute. If you look on Daled Omid Aleph, the second tosis on the page. I wanted to, just to confirm what we've been.
Daled Amud Aleph, yes.
Daled Omid Aleph.
Yeah, I
second tosis Hatzara Shava Shebehen.
Yes.
So I'm just going to read the Hatzara Shava Shebehen Shayidei Taina Ukvira, etc. Tosis asks, this is on Daled Omid Aleph, just to make it clear. The second tosis Hatzara Shava, but Shayidei Taina Ukvira. You'll see where it comes in later on. But since you asked me and you're looking for the language, I'm just going to read it for a second. It'll take 1 minute. What do you mean? The Gemara says anytime you have a taina and a kfira, a claim and a denial, that there's a chi of shua. So Tosa says, what are you talking about? That's not true. Kofra kol, there's no chi of shua. We'll see. So Tosa says, yesh lomar debat tzara shavish behem yesh taina chashuva. We don't mean any claim. We mean any
as if to say
serious claim.
A serious claim, a significant claim. What makes it significant?
As if they say yes, raglayim l'davar. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what Tosas adds. The kishamoda miktas o eid makhisho near the mishaker. But we're going to challenge this in a moment. We're going to see that Rashi in a few minutes, we're going to see that Rashi in Bava Kama, not Rashi in the other places, but Rashi in Bava Kama Kuv Zayin Amud Aleph, and the Rimigash in Masechet Shavuos Mem Hey Omud Beis, they have a bit of a different take. They don't disagree with the actual laws, but they do disagree with like some of the principles here. And they're of the opinion, I'll just tell you now, and I'll show it to you later, that even a taina bialma could trigger a shvua, which is a quite remarkable idea.
And
But
the
the
Rambam,
Ramban, what?
Rambam follows suit.
It's
Gash
not.
talking
It's
about
not clear. It's not clear only because the Rimi Gash doesn't say Kofar Kol is Kai V'Shvua. No one says that. But the reason why it's Patur is a more incidental reason, and therefore it's not conceptually wrong. So since the Rambam just in this case just paskins, it's hard to know. He just paskins Kofar Kol. You're right. In other, and especially in recent cases, we've been seeing this correlation between the Rambam and the Rimi Gash, which is a very, very powerful.
aren't that many people the Rambam respected, but the Rimi Gash was definitely one.
Yeah. Yeah, no, in the introduction to Yada Chazaka,
He says he got a headache. When
yeah,
says,
he says that his intel he speaks about the Rimi Gash, and and he says like his intellect, he had like a scary intellect. So as you say, the Rambam was not one, he wasn't shy in retiring, and he wasn't one to
oh, accolades.
pay compliments, without very
Gratuitously.
strong reasons. So, as you can imagine, the Rambam was very, strong-minded himself. So, so you can just imagine what the Rebbe Gash was. So, yeah, both of them. I mean, the Rambam, as we've said many times, the Rambam was very, very influenced by the Rebbe Gash, but he's also, independent, even of the Rimi Gash. Rambam's in it, he's always has his own mind. Anyway, which is, by the way, a very interesting. Another thing I forgot to put on the Talmud, but I'll read to you. You'll see in a moment that given the Rambam's personality, the way that he paskins the din of Reb Chia is quite surprising. We'll see in a moment what I mean by that. Okay, but before we get to that, let's go back to Gimel Amud Aleph. So what we have here is, one more time, a Chiddush of Reb Chia. The background for the Chiddush of Reb Chia is that Kofar HaKol is Patur, Mishvua. Moda B'Miktzas is Chayiv, B'Shvua. Those are Dinim D'Oraisa. Those are biblical laws.
Where is in Gimel Amud Aleph?
Back to Gimel Amud Aleph.
Gimel Amud Aleph. Where in the daf here?
Oh, towards the, I'm sorry, I think you came off of the left. Towards the bottom of the page, do you see the asterisk of the two dots, Tony Reb Chia, Monoli Biadecha?
Yeah.
That's what we're reading. So one more time. We have Kofar HaKol is Patur, Moda Mixus is Chayiv. The question is, what happens in a situation where you have Kofar HaKol, but you also have two Eidim who support half of the claim? Now, when they support half of the claim, they're not denying the other half. They're just not, they have no knowledge about the other half, but they are supporting half the claim. So instead of Moda B'Mixas, it's Mechayiv B'Mixas Al Yidei Eidim. That's Reb Chia's big chiddush. And the question is, so Reb Chia says, why does Reb Chia think that you can substitute Eidim for Hodas Miktsas? Because he says, Mikal V'chomer. Shalot Hei, Hodas Piv Gedola Mehadas Eidim, right? Mikal V'chomer. The Chomer is, what generally is a more powerful source of information?
Hodas
Baldin is Kamei Edim. What? And then the Gemara is gonna challenge this on that basis exactly. But what normally is a more powerful objective source of knowledge? Two witnesses or a piv?
Two witnesses.
Witnesses are typically the gold standard. So Reb Chia said, listen, if chiyuv miktsas al yedei piv hodas baldin kamedim dami is makes the taina chashuva ad kadei kach that it triggers a shvua daraisa, then miktsas chiyuv al yedei edim hol shekain should be able to substitute for that and trigger a chiyuv shvua daraisa on the sha'ar meaning the part that you're not paying, the part that you're still kofar. So again, what happened was he said you owe me 100. This guy said, I owe you 0. The Adam said you owe 30. And we don't know about the other 70. So you would pay the 30, just like in the case of Moda B'Miktsas, you would swear on the 70, because even though we don't have a Moda B'Miktsas, we have a Chiyuv B'Miktsas Al Yidei Edim. And according to Rabbi Chia, that's good enough. That's what these words mean. Shelo te'odas piv gedola mehadas edem mikav chomer. So then the Gemara wants to bring a proof that this is true, and they want to bring a proof from our mission of Shnai Mos and Batalis. Now, this line in the Gemara, I'm going to read quickly because we've dealt with this already. We've been jumping, in and out of the first 8 dapim a lot. I just divided it up for organizational purposes. So this line in the Gemara that we're about to read now is something that we plays a very prominent role in Shnai Mos and Batalis, so you're going to be familiar with it. He says, "Vetana tuna." Tana tuna means the Tana brings a raya, a proof that you could substitute hadas edim for hadas piv from the Mishnah that says Shnai Moksa Batalis, Zeomarni Mitzasiya, Zeomarni Mitzasiya, right? And what do we say in that case? Each one makes a claim that the object belongs to him. What do we do in that case? We say that each one takes half, and each one has to swear on half. So this is very strange. This is quite strange. But the Gemara at this point thought that the shvua of the Mishnah in Shnai Moksa Batalis is a shvua daraisa, a biblical obligation. It's
Like
not.
mo-
The
like
Gemara is going to
mo-
reject it. But
like motive of mixus.
so they thought, oh, how come you're taking a shvua daraisa? Where's the motive of mixus? Each one's saying kula shali. The answer is because since each one is holding on to the talis, and we consider each one holding on as if 50% belongs to them. So that's the next line of the Gemara. V'hacha, kiven the tough is since each one is holding on to the talis. Anan Sadi, this is what Tosas quoted on Beis Amud Aleph. We are witnesses. He's equating the legal significance of holding on, each one holding on, and that being, triggering, tfisa. The tfisa is the equivalent of edus, of anan sadi, demaida tafis haididei, umaida tafis haididei, uktani yishava, right?
So the tfisa is calling the other guy a liar, basically.
Each
For
tfisa,
that 50%.
I'll say it this way: each tfisa establishes a right of the other of its party to 50%, and so that's why there's a shvua daraisa. Now later on in another daf, the Gemara is going to get back to this, and the Gemara is going to say that's a terrible proof, because it would be the equivalent of Ruvain saying to Shimon, "You owe me $100." Shimon saying, "I don't owe you a penny." Two witnesses coming along and saying he owes 50, and two other witnesses coming along and saying, yeah, but the other 50 he doesn't owe. There would be no shvua in that case, right? Because here you have each one being tofes. If you're saying each one's tvisa is the equivalent of anan sadi, it's like having witnesses $50
Cancel each other out. So the witnesses
right?
cancel each other out.
They cancel each other out, and or at least in this, they're not even contradicting each other. One is made on the first 50. Let's say 30 and 70. All right, let's say make it easier. So one of them is, let's say one's holding on to, I don't know, to 2/3, and the other one's holding on to a third. So that. Why is everybody swearing? The person who's holding on to 2/3 has support, his tfisa. The person who's holding on to 1/3 has support, his tfisa. So it's as if, I said you owe me $100, and the other guy said I don't know anything, right? And then I brought witnesses who said you owe $30. So if that was the end of the story, you'd swear on the 70. But let's say two other items showed up and said, we know for a fact he doesn't owe the remaining 70. Well, you wouldn't take a shua. Where does it say that? That's the Gemara. If you just take turn for 1 minute on Dalid Amud Aleph. It took the Gemara a whole daf to say, by the way, the proof that we brought earlier is not a good proof. We've seen this Gemara already. We saw this Gemara when we were talking about Shnai Mos and Batalis. But just to review for a minute, the look on Dalid Amud Aleph. It's not in the sheet, so it only if you have a Gemara. Yeah. 1 second. Yeah. Ella de Ka'amar, It's almost in the middle of the page. You see where the Gemara says Ela de Ka'amar Vatana Tuna?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would say, yeah, it's like middle of the page. So the Gemara says Ela de Ka'amar Tana Ela de Ka'amar the Tana Tuna. The Gemara that previously said we have a proof from the Mishnah of Shnai Mosin that Reb Chia, namely that you could substitute Hodas Piv for Hadas Edim and create the equivalent of Moda b'miktsas or Chiyuv b'miktsas Chayiv Shvua, right? That raya, that proof, midami, is that a good proof? Is that comparable to what we're talking about? Hassam, in the case of Shnai Moksem Batalis, each one is holding on. It's as if each one has witnesses, right? The tfisa is the equivalent of support that backs his claim. Hassam lemalva islay sahadi, lelova islay sahadi. It's as if the malva had evidence that that he is owed 30, and the lova had evidence that he doesn't owe the other 70, right? Delo masik levelomidi, right? Di havale sadi lelova, delo masik levelomidi. If on the controversial part there was evidence exonerating the lova, right? Lo boy Rab Chia l'shtabue. Rab Chia wouldn't say that in that case, that he has to take a shvua. So hacha ki hechad anan sadi b'hai, anan sahadi b'hai, v'afilo hachi mishtabai. But in the case of Shleimos and Batalis, they're evenly matched in all the evidence, and they're still taking shuas. Rab Chia's case, they're not evenly matched in the evidence, right? A makes a claim, B denies, A brings witnesses on 50%, or 30%, and on the rest, there's no evidence one way or another. So everything is tilted in favor of, the one who brings the witnesses. But in the case of the Mishnah, there are two parties, two protagonists, two claimants, right? And each one is equally supported by a tfisa. So obviously that's not comparable to Reb Chia, right? And the Gemara goes on to say, the whole shvuah of the Mishnah is only a shvuah d'Rabbanan, which we know. Ratz Rabbi Yochanan's chiddush, shelo tehei kol echad v'yachad, shelo yehei, kol echad v'yachad tokef b'taliso shel chaveiro v'omer shalihu. The shvuah of the Mishnah is only a shvuah d'Rabbanan. Meaning it's a very interesting thing. It's an interesting phenomenon that the Gemara for a whole daf was, or that the Gemara, even in these two lines on Gimel and Aleph, was somehow thinking that they had a strong equation, from the Mishnah to the din of Reb Chia. And then the Gemara in Dalet and Aleph it's not like if you look at the two Gemaras, the one in Dalet and Aleph is the obvious one. It makes you scratch your head a little bit and wonder what were they thinking on Gimel and Aleph. But okay,
it may be out of respect for Reb Chia.
No, it doesn't. It's not Reb Chia. Reb Chia didn't bring the raya.
No, but they were trying to find a way to they were forcing themselves to look for a way to justify Reb Chia's position.
Oh, maybe. But in a way, that doesn't, in the end, it doesn't support him if you bring a bad proof,
Yeah.
So, no, as it happens, there's hashgacha in front of this and these things too, siyata d'shmaya. So the fact that the Gemara thought this way and called tfisa anansadi plays a big role in our Shnai Moks and Batalas case. If you remember, Tosa starts off the Masechta by saying, that when two people hold on to a talis, it's not a suffix, it's each one has a vadai half. After all, he says the Gemara calls it anansadi. But when you think, when we learned that Gemara, the first thing I pointed out was, yes, it does, and this is the Gemara. But that doesn't last very long. It's interesting that even though we're docha the raya, they still think it's a kind of anansadi. You could have said, oh, everything about it is wrong. The proof for Reb Chia is wrong. That we certainly conclude. But maybe the characterization of Shnaimo, like one of the other Rishonim, like the Rambam and the Tosas Rid and the Rivon Tosas and Bama Basra that we discussed in the beginning of the year. What do they do with this Gemara about anansadi? They're not going to lose any sleep. They'll say, yeah, the Gemara had a moment where they thought that they had a proof from the Mishnah and they were learning, Reb Chia in a certain way. They were learning the Mishnah in a certain way. And then the Gemara in Dalet Amud Aleph says that it's not correct. What's not correct? Maybe 50% of it is not correct, or 100% of it is not. So they'll say the whole characterization is wrong, right? Whereas the Balitosis thought, this is what's so fascinating, that, Tafastum, it's not a good proof for Rabbi, but that doesn't mean it's an inaccurate portrayal of Shnai Moksa Batalis, right? This is a very interesting methodological, parshanut question in a way, meaning when the Gemara, has a certain perspective
Doesn't mean you can extend
with
it.
implications, and then the Gemara goes on to reject that for other reasons. How much of the original characterization remains normative? Should you assume like, oh, the part they didn't attack is
That
true?
depends on how similar the two cases are.
Yeah.
If they're
It's a
similar,
very
then it's
interesting
rejected
question.
for everything. If they're not similar, then it's not rejected for everything.
Okay. So what do we have so far? So far we have this idea that Rab Chia extended the principle of moda b'miktsas to chiyuv b'miktsas. That if you have Edom to test, even in a kofar hakol case, where the Edom testify about a miktsas chiyuv, then there would be a chiyuv shvua al ashar. That would also come under the shvua doraisa, profile of moda b'miktsas. That's what Rab Chia says. Now, if you do we pascha like Rab Chia, then the Gemara is going to go on, to analyze, this kal v'chomer of Rab Chia. Can you really substitute edus? Can you really substitute piv? I'm sorry, edus for piv? Can you really assume that it's the same thing? So that's what the Gemara.
That's better, not that it's the same.
Better, and therefore you can substitute. Yeah. So the Gemara is going to attack this this whole kal v'chomer. But Aga, before we get to that, all that, and the next lines of the Gemara, just so that you should be aware, the if you look on Daf Hey Omid Aleph for a minute, and those of you who have regular Gemaras, if you don't, just you'll hear me,
One second. Okay, where?
If you look on Hey Omid Aleph,
Yes.
so the Gemara towards the top, Toshma Detoni Avua Dirav Aptoriki. This is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 17 lines down from the top of the page.
Yeah.
Tashma.
The Tane Avua. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the beginning of the line.
So the Gemara says, Tashma, the Tani Avua Dirav Aptoriki Lidrabchia Kemaisa. He said, I'm sorry, the Tani Dirav Aptoriki. So this, the father of, Rabbi Aptoriki, okay, said, Lidra Bchia Kemaisa, Manoli Biadecha Valomer Ein Lecha Biadi Klum, Va'edem Mi'edem Osa Sheyesh Biado Chamishim Zuz, Yochal Yishava Al Ashar, right? Talmud Lomar Al Kol Aveda Sheyomar Ki Huzet, Al Hodos Piv Ata Mechayvo, V'Ata Mechayvo Al Hados Edim. So the father of Rabbi Aptoriki said to Rab Chia, I disagree with your psak. And he wanted to learn from, it says, Al Kol Aveda Sheyomar Kihuzeh. By the way, that is in Parshas Mishpatim that we just read this past Shabbos, that pasuk.
Mm-hmm.
And the words Asher
learning a
Yomar, and the words Asher Yomar Kihuzeh is the makar of Moda B'Miktas. So he says, Al Kol Aveda Sheyomar Kihuzeh, Al Hodas Piv Atom Chayvo. If he is moda b'miktsas, meaning the guy says you owe me X amount, and he says I don't owe you X, but I owe you X minus something. I owe you 50%, 30%, 20%. It doesn't make a difference, right? So that's Asher Yomar Ki Huzeh. Al Hadah said, but you can't assume that just because moda b'miktsas is chayiv shvua, that chiyuv al yidei edim b'miktsas
So this is
is
a
mechayiv
drush.
shvua.
This is a drush,
What? It's his drasha, yeah. Against Rab Chia.
and a drusha overwhelms a.
So the Gemara says, Masnisa, Karamis, Aleh Rabbi Chia. This is the Brisa that he was quoting. Rabbi Chia Tanu Polig. Rabbi
You
Chia
can argue with
doesn't,
it.
he doesn't
But
accept
besides
that.
that, the question is, if you, in many cases, we have a process that says that when something is logically, but clearly logical, it has
Yeah.
a certain hierarchy in the relationship. Which is higher, a drush which I don't know where the base of the drush is, or logic that, because Avchia's logic could be very strong in one case if you look at it. I mean,
Right. Right. It's a good question. It's a good question. Anyways, you see what you see from this Gemara in Hayamid Aleph that not everybody agree with Rabbi Chia. Okay. And then the Gemara says, Vakra Kamar, Hahu Lamoda Mixas Hataina. He learns the drasha differently. Hamoda Lamoda Mixas Hataina. Vavud Rab up to Riki Amalach, Ksivhu, Ksivze, Chad Lamoda Mixas Hataina, Vchad Lada Sedim, the Potter. V'idach, Chad Lamoda Mixas Hataina, Vchad Lamoda Mi Min Hataina. V'idach, Moda Mi Min Hataina, Leisley. The Savak Rabbi Gamliel, Tanu Chitim, Hoda Besarim Potter, Rabbi I'm not going into all the details. That doesn't make a difference. What I'm trying to establish is that, two dapim later, Rab Avua, Avua de Rab Apturiki puts up a good fight against Rab Chia, and there's an exchange. What would he do with this drasha? What would he do with that drasha? With this din, etc. Meaning there ends up being a machlokes Rab Chia and Abua de Rab Apturiki lahalacha. Now, what's the psak? So if you look at Tosfos here on Hayom and Aleph, right? It says Isa l'drab. The Gemara goes on. They ask some questions, right? Isa l'drab. The Gemara continues discussing back and forth if we paskin like Rabbi or not. The Gemara doesn't come out definitively, but at one point the Gemara uses the expression Isa l'drab. If Rabbi was right, sounds like they're not so sure if he's right. So look at Tosfos. Tosfos says quickly, Nira. You see the Tosfos Isa l'drab.
yeah, near the bottom.
So Tosa says, Nira the halacha kirabchia. It seems like the Gemara is working hard just to uphold the position of Rabchia, because we paskin like Rabchia. The ha le'el mukila karabanan. The Rabbi Gamliel the halacha kavasayu. Then Tosas continues to discuss: is that true? Is it not true? If you look at Tosas in Masachet Shavuos, you have a parallel Tosas, and the Rajba in Shavuos and the Rajba here quotes the position of Rabbeinu Hananel. It seems like Rabbeinu Hananel might have changed his mind about this question. Do we paskin like Rabbi Chia? Do we not paskin like Rabbi Chia?
Besides
The strong consensus.
Who's arguing with Rabbi? Besides the Abu the Rav?
No, he's the one that explicitly, but it's not clear.
It's two Tanoim arguing.
What?
It's two Tanoim arguing.
Yeah. So, but the question is, who do we pass? Who does the flow of the Gemara is supports him or doesn't support him? We'll see also when we get to the Shaklavataria Gimel base to Dalet and Aleph, like it's back and forth and forth and back. It is a Kavachomer. It's not a Kavachomer. It's a good Kavachomer. It's a weak Kavachomer. It's not in the Gemara itself. You have both views, and it's not 100% clear how we paskin. But Tosas in a bunch of places, Tos Rabbeinu Peretz and others, they paskin like Reb Chia. The Rajba reports that Rabbeinu Hananel changed his mind. That originally he paskined like Avua Derav Aptariki against Reb Chia, and then later he changed his mind in accordance with the position.
So the issue here is not necessarily the hierarchy of the Kal V'Chomer, but whether the Kal V'Chomer is really what Reb Chia says the Kal V'Chomer is.
What do you mean?
That's the argument. Because Reb Chia wants to make it out that Adam is greater than Hadas Piv.
Right.
One, as I said earlier, one could say Hadas Pivka Meya Adam. I mean,
they're going to discuss. That's
arguing
that comes
with
up.
The strength of a Kal V'Chomer, or are we arguing that the Kal V'Chomer that Rav Chia wants to say is not necessarily the way Rav Chia wants to portray it?
So we'll see. We'll discuss that. We'll discuss it because it's not just the case of Rabbi. You'll see in a moment. It gets very exciting, but a little complicated. what is the actual class? I presented the case of Rabbi Chia according to the simple reading of the Gemara, and according to the Rambam, we'll see that the Rajba and others felt that the classic case of Rabbi Chia is more controversial than that. I'll show you that in just a minute. And then there's other cases, that make. Let me just explain what the principle of what I mean. Rabbi Chia is giving Rabbi Chia's case a case where there's a chiyuv miktsas. There's a taina, kofra kol, and a chiyuv miktsas. But at least Rabbi Chia's case, as we've discussed it so far, is a chiyuv miktsas that is triggered by the gold standard edim. Let's say the chiyuv miktsas, once you say chiyuv miktsas can substitute for moda b'miktsas, is it dafka edus, which determines chiyuv miktsas? What about other things that determine chiyuv miktsas?
Such as?
So we'll see in a moment. Oh, I'll tell you the case in a moment. You'll see, and I'll show you inside the Rajba. So the Rajba makes the argument that the Rabbi Chia's case in the Gemara is not what we think it is. It's not that the Edom come along and they testify directly. Yes, we know for a fact that he borrowed at least $50. The real case is as follows. Ruvain said to Shimon, okay, ready for this? Ruvain said to Shimon, I lent you $100, right? And you didn't pay me back. You owe me $100. Shimon said to Ruvain, I never borrowed $100 from you. Lo lavisi. Okay. And then according to Rajba, the witnesses come to court and they say, we don't know about the payment, but we do know that there was a loan. Okay. So,
But that's only half of the
wait,
thing.
wait, one sec. We know about that at least 50% of that money was lent.
The Gemara talks about this case explicitly somewhere.
So that's called kol ha'omer lo lavisi, ki ilu omar lo paraiti, meaning the defendant, he, as Shakespeare used to say, and my mother liked to quote often, he was the lova in this case, is hosted by his own petard, meaning he destroys his own case by claiming that he never borrowed. Right, he loses the ability to say I borrowed but I paid it. Kola Omar lo lavisi. Anybody who says I didn't borrow is ki'ilu Omar lo paraiti.
Can't say he paid what he didn't
That's
borrow.
called huksa kafran, meaning if the Edom come, now what do the Edom say? Let me make it clear. The Edom come to court and they say, we know for a fact that there was a loan of $50. We know nothing about the piron, not of the 50 or not of the loan. We don't know anything about a loan of 100, and we don't know anything about a piron or even of 50. Now, had the case developed differently, let's say Ruvain came to court and he said, you borrowed $100 from me. Okay. And then and you didn't pay me back. And let's say Shimon said, it's true I borrowed $100 from you, but I did pay you back. Lavisi uparati. I paid you back. Okay. Now Edom came to court.
Does he have a proof?
One second. And then Edom came to court and they said, we can testify, we can attest to the fact that there was a halva, but we know nothing about the piron. What would happen in that case? That's kofar kol.
The Edom didn't contribute anything because the guy admitted that he borrowed.
Exactly. Now, the case of Rabbi Chia, if you interpret like the Rajba, is a tricky case because if you interview the Edom, they don't know anything about the piron. They don't know for sure that even there's a mixas chiyuv. All they know is that there's huksa kafran, right? I mean that all they know is that the so-called loveh or the defendant, right, lied about taking out a loan. So they don't know that there's a chiyuv, mammon. They only know that there is what they know just triggers a second a process called kol omer lo lavisi, kilo omer lo paraiti.
Well, once that standard
Now,
is,
why would the Rajba? You know what? Let's look at the Rajba instead of talking. But
once that standard is in effect, then from the outset he's stuck. This guy,
he's hoisted on his own petard.
he's a chakran from day one.
Meaning he hung his hat. He tied his fate to the claim that he didn't borrow the money.
So is he
So
not?
now his fate is going to be determined by the evidence whether he borrowed, even though the most salient legal question is not whether he borrowed, but whether he owes.
But it depends if we're looking at that or we're looking at credibility. If we're looking at credibility, the fact that the Edom come and say he borrowed means that Ruvain, the lender, is an honest person, and Shimon, the borrower,
Very
is a
true.
liar.
But let's say it this way. Why did I start with the first case? Because a simple reading of the Gemara is that it's the first case. The Edom come along and they're mechayev. They say we can testify that he owes partially. Right? I mean, if you just look at Rabbi, what he says, manoli biadecha, vala amar, ein li klum, va'edim mi'idim, that he owes 50. So the simple reading of the text is not like the Rajba. Right? That's number one. So we'll have to see what motivated the Rajba. But beyond the simple reading of the text, the idea of substituting, when a person says, ani moda b'miktsas, he's saying, I owe you $30. I owe you $50. But if Edom come along and they say, we don't know anything about paraita, but we know about lavisa, right? On a legal plane, they are being mechayev $30 or $50 or $70, but they're not. The evidence, what their actual knowledge is just about an earlier fact in the case, a huksakafran. They're not really. When Piv says, I owe you, I admit I owe you $50, Hodos Balin Kanedim, I mean, that's a direct chiyuv mamon. But when the Edom say, Lavisa aval ein anu yodim in parata, but then the law triggers the rule of kola omer lo lavisi ki ilo omer lo paraiti, right? That's an extra step. That's a little more mechudash. So it's not for the Gemara to say, oh, it's a kavachomer, hadas edim is superior to hadas piv, which is what the Gemara says. In addition to that question alone, which the Gemara is then going to analyze on Gimel Amud Beis and Dalet Amud Aleph, there's also another facet, and that is the pragmatic chiyuv mamon, as opposed to the more substantive chiyuv mamon. Now,
isn't it all about the fundamental issue at stake? The fundamental issue at stake in Moda B'Miktsas is credibility, whether you say raglayim ladov. In other words, the minute somebody proves that this guy had something going on over here, his credibility declines.
Yeah, but not all credibility issues are equal and the same, right? So the credibility of, oh, he admitted half the claim in terms of owing the money, or let's say the next level, Edom supported half the claim. Those credibility problems, or those
severe as a guy who denied
are much stronger than, he said he didn't borrow and the Edom said he borrowed, but even they don't know that he owes the money, right? I mean, that's just true. You could say it is a credibility problem called but it's not comparable to
so the question, what is the factor that causes the shvur by Moda B'Miktsas?
Right.
Is it credibility to go to the brisker approach? I mean, what's the essence of the reason that one has to
switch? Yeah, so that's being tested. And that's what we're going to be exploring. But before I do this, let me read the Rajba, so you'll see that A, I'm not making it up. B, concretize it for you. And then I want to just get back to the Rambam because and then we'll see how much we can get through. And then this is going to take us a little bit. Look at page 5. You see, it says Chidush Rajba Masechet Bava Metzia Gimel Amud Aleph.
Hidush Harashba.
Yeah,
Echte Bava Metzia Daf Gimel Amud Aleph.
yeah. You see that?
Yes,
So that is on the bottom of page 5, correct?
correct.
So listen to what it says. Everybody have it? Anybody who wants to have it? Or do you want me to wait?
I'm sure we've got it.
Okay. So I'm going to take Shtika Kehoda again. You know? So this is what he says. Listen to this. Hoda Amr Abchia Mano Li Biyadecha V'Alo Amr Lecha Biyadi Klom. Va'edem Midem Sheish Biyado Chamishim Zuz. This is just a quote of the Gemara. No sin Chamishim Zuz V'Yishava Al Ashar. That's what the text of Rabbi in our Gemara, right? Says Rajba, Al Korchach, the legal analysis, leads us to conclude. I could add the words, even though it's not the simple reading of the text, but the analysis legally leads us to conclude al korchenu, even though it's, legally, even though it's textually problematic, but legally this is the only conclusion to reach. Kishein ha'edim mi'idim sheyesh adayin biyado hishnuya. That a case where the edim don't actually establish that he really owes him $50. The ihalchi, what's his problem? Why wouldn't he read the Gemara? If somebody's not going to read a text, kipshuto, he has to have a good reason, right? Here, the Rajba is explaining there's a legal reason. The reason is the ihachi. If edim the edim are going to say that he owes the money, right? Then that's called Havale Shibud Karkos. Kedekaimelon Shibud Daraisa. The Echad Milva Bishtar, the Echad Milva Alpeh, Governor Nayarshin, Uminala Kuchos. I'll explain in a second. The Kaimelon Einish Boim Al Kfiras Shibud Karkos. The Hodeva Karkos, the Kafar Bekelim Patur, who Kedetan Bishvuos and Maisina Besamoch. Okay. So there is a rule called, this is the laws of liens, liens, or mortgaged property. So the short take of it is, if witnesses were to come to court and they were to establish that Shimon owes Reuven $50 directly, right? So Minat Torah, that would mean that Reuven can collect. If Reuven can't collect from Shimon because he doesn't have any nechasim b'nei chori, he doesn't have any available property. All his property is mortgaged, to is based on mortgage or liens, right? So there would be no shvua anyway, because we have a rule. That's the Gemara on Haywood Base. The Gemara says ein nishbaim al kfiras shibu karkos. There's a rule ein nishbaim al karkos. You don't take an oath on karka, on real estate, and any loan which can end up with a collection of real estate is also called real estate, and therefore there would be no shvua connected to any monetary obligation that might end up with a collection of real estate. Says the Rajba, if we were talking about the normal, simple reading of the case, which is the Edom come and they say this guy owes $50, there would be no shvua according to Rabbi, even if it was comparable to motive mixas, because it would come under the rubric of English boy malkvir shibu karkos.
Yeah, but
So what's the case?
That's the case if one takes that theoretical approach,
yeah.
and the Gemara brings this up in other places, then you can never have any rule. The Gemara talks about a murderer who can claim that the guy was a treifa. He would have died anyway, so he shouldn't be.
I'm not seeing the connection.
In other words, the idea that we're saying that any loan that theoretically could be covered by a karka,
a lien,
we're on any loan could theoretically end up that way.
Are you saying it's too abstract? Yeah, but I hear the argument, and when we get to that topic, we'll speak about it. The Rambam actually, and the Rimi Gash and the Rambam have a different take, but that's a Gemara. That's a Gemara. The Gemara says that on here. here in Bava Metzia. So the question is, why are we concerned if it's several steps down the road as opposed to, let's say, other legal matters? That's a good question, but it's still factually the case. Well, that Einish Boim Al Kvir Shibud Karkos. So even if it isn't karka directly, but it's a lien. So the Rajma is saying, so it can't be that case. So what case can it be? Elahachi ba'omer einacha biyadi klum. The case is a case where Ruvain says to Shimon, you owe me $100. And Shimon says, I don't owe you anything because not only did, I didn't even borrow from you. Shalo hilvisani klum. You didn't lend me anything. In other words, he hangs his hat, he mortgages his, future taina on the bigger claim, not that he paid, but that he never borrowed. The ha'edim mi'idim shehilvo chamishim. And the edim come along and they say, you know what? He definitely borrowed at least $50, right? We don't know about the payment. We don't know if that he owes you, but we know that he borrowed from you at least $50. The chala omer lalavisi, and whoever says, I did not even borrow, it's as if he said, and if I did borrow, right, then I forfeit my claim that I paid. Okay, so kala omer lo lavisi, ke omer lo paraiti dami. Why does that help you? So the Rajma says, if that's what's going on, I mean, it's part penalty or hoisted on his own petard, that you can't blame lekuchos. You're not going to collect, liens, from innocent purchasers, because he's playing games. If the Adam said directly that Shimon owes money to Ruvain and there's no other way to collect, then you're going to go and take the mortgage property. But if the Adam don't even know that there's a chiyuv, all they know is that there was a loan, and it's based on his personal, his chayvus, or sakafrim, whatever you want to say. We're taking it away from him almost like to penalize him, right? You can't put that on the back of the owners of the property. They shouldn't lose their property to that kind of a mortgage when the Adam themselves don't know that there's a chiyuv. That's why the Rajba, and not just the Rajba, by the way, the Rajba, the Ritva, the Ran, the Nemuka Yosef, they all went along with it. I think the Rajba was the first one to point it out. So he said, therefore, you can't read the Gemara Kipshuto. It's got to be this other, more exotic case. But once it's this more exotic case, right, it's even less a clear comparison to Piv, to Hodas Piv, to Hodas Baldin. Because in Hodas Baldin, the guy's saying, he's admitting directly, I do owe X amount of money, 50, not 100. So if you wanted to compare the Adam, say he owes 50, we don't know about the 100. That's more comparable. But once you introduce the Rajba, which is he borrowed 50, we don't even know that he owes 50. He's going to have to pay 50 because of his folly, of kala omer lo lavisi ki'ilu omer lo paraiti. So there's tashlume chamishim without there being necessarily chiyuv, right? An objective chiyuv of chamishim. That's what saves you from the shibud problem, right? But now that's a very
But it's
you were asking me before, right? It's a logical question you were saying. What is it about motiv mixas, right, that makes you chayiv v'shvua? So the answer is that's exactly you're totally right. That's the legal question. But the point is that we're moving. How diluted can the common denominator be? Is what I'm trying to say. On one level, you could say, well, it needs to be your own admission. Anything less, not just a chiyuv edim. Okay. Or the next thing is the chiyuv of edim themselves saying he owes money. Now we're already expanding it to tashlume miktsas, even though on the basis of some more extraneous process of kala omer lo levisu ki lo amar lo paraiti. Right? So this is the Rashba. Now, if you look at the Rambam, which I should have put here, and oh no, maybe I did. I did. Oh no, I didn't. Did I? Wait a minute. Oh, I did. Yeah. Okay. Not as bad as I thought. Page 4. One page over earlier. I mentioned before, how does the Rambam paskin the din of Rab? Does he paskin like Rab Chia or not like Rab Chia? So now there are two questions, by the way. Well, we started off with the position of Rab Chia, right? And we're reading according to the simple reading of the Gemara. Then we pointed out that the Gemara in Hayom Aleph says that Avua de Rav Toriki, right, argues with Rab Chia. Correct? Then we pointed out that there's a machlokas, do we paskin like Rab Chia or Abua de Rav Aptariki? That's what Tosas discusses, and according to the Rashba and Shavuos, the Rabbeinu Hananel changed his mind. Now we've introduced a new complication, and that is, what is Rab Chia even saying? According to the Rashba, Rab Chia has already expanded, what we thought. He's not saying if Edom testify on a chiyuv b'miktzas, you have to take a shvu on the rest, and even that, is disputed by Avua the Rav Aptariki. He's saying a bigger chiddush even. He's saying tashlume miktzas, even if it comes from kol omer lo lavisi ki'ilo omer lo paraiti, by virtue of his denying that he took the loan, he's now, held accountable, for the question of payment once it's established that he took the loan. Kol omer lo lavisi ki'ilo omer lo paraiti. So now the court, do you paskin like that? So let's go back to the Rambam. The Rambam in Tohin, Hilchos Tohin, Perek Dalet, Halacha Yud. Very simple. There are two things to note. Mona li biadecha, says the Rambam. Everybody have it? This is on page 4 of the Mar Makomos.
Yes.
And we'll finish up for today in a minute. So the Rambam says, Mona li biadecha. Cases, the guy says, you owe me $100, like the Gemara. The guy answers, Einacha biyadi klum. Kofra kol. He says, I don't owe you anything. The ha'edim mi'idim alav, and the edim testify, she'adayin yeshlo etzlo chamishin. The word adayin should be underlined here or
It
italicized.
means that he paid 50.
Meaning not like the Rashba. The Rashba is responding to the Rambam. He's saying this is the Edom actually, like the simple reading of the Gemara, say he owes him, not he has to give him. Not because of Kol Omer Lo Lavisu Kil Omer Lo Paraiti. Saying we know that he owes him the money. We know Lo Para. In the Rashba's case, they don't testify Lo Para. They only testify Lava. Just that then we invoke the law, the rule of Kol Omer Lo Lavisi Kil Omer Lo Paraiti. There's an added step and a distancing of the chiyuv. It's tashlume miktsas, not chiyuv miktsas. It is chiyuv, but it's a different. You understand what I'm saying? It's not a chiyuv because we know he owes it. It's a chiyuv because the way that he structured his response now commits him either to prove once it's been established that there was a loan, right? So he loses the case, whether or not in objective. If we knew objectively that he didn't pay, that might be different, but we don't. So now he's hoisted on his own petard, right? But for the Rambam, it's not true. The Rambam says what the Edom say is he owes. We know he didn't pay. What does Rambam do with Shibud Karkos? So I'm not going to prove this right now. I'm going to leave this for later in a few months, probably take a month or two. The Rambam and the Rimigash have a different take on the extension of Einish by Malkfir or Shibud Karkos. You'll have to take my word for that right now. But the Rimigash's position is quoted in the Shita Mukubatzes and Bab Metzia. And the Rambam in Hilchos Shavuos and in Hilchos Ishus, Reb Chaim, in the Chidush Rabbeinu Chaim Alevi al Rambam, he has two different treatments of the Rambam Shita of Ein Nishbaim al Kfir Shibud Karkos. So as it happens, I don't know how many people connect them, but I like to connect them. The Rambam could say a dayan here, and he doesn't have the Rajba's problem because he has a different take on the issue which troubled the Rajba. So you'll take my word on that for the moment. But then what's fascinating is, even though the Rambam's Rab Chia is more compelling than the Rajba's Rab Chia, because the Rajba has diluted the common denominator for legal reasons. He thinks that it has to be the pshat. But for the Rambam didn't dilute it. It's a dayin chayev. Nonetheless, the Rambam is so reticent to paskin like Rab Chia. Look what he says. Pasku kol agonim halacha sheishalem chamishim. All the gonim paskin that in the case of Rab Chia, the guy pays 50, v'yishav al ashar. Shalotei odas piv gedola me'adas edim. When does the Rambam quote the reasoning of a Gemara? Usually just quotes the psak. Clearly, the Rambam was on a pure logical. So this is what we were saying before. The
Rambam's holding like the fundamental interpretation we had originally.
Yes. And even then, he is reticent about the psak. How many times does the Rambam paskin in Yad HaChazaka by saying all the Gaonim paskin this way? Very rare. Meaning he'll quote the Gaonim to disagree, or that there's or that he'll disagree with the Gaonim, he'll whatever. But to quote a halacha as the psak of the Gaonim, as opposed to like this is the psak, which he agrees with, a psak that he agrees with, where he's not even quoting the argument, is very rare. This is just a style point, but it's not just a style point. Meaning in Yad HaChazaka, the Rambam does not, he's not so beholden, or if he is, certainly that it's rare for him to issue a psak because it's the view of Kol HaGaonim when he doesn't even quote the controversy, and this is his psak. He's standing by it.
The problem with the controversy is that while the Rashba points out a problem, his solution is, his interpretation is like,
pretty radical.
Yeah, in other words, so you got a problem, and it's the old joke, the solution's, the worse than the problem.
Yeah.
So Rambam is, I think, willing, which is typical of the Rambam, who doesn't always look at the nitty gritty of
No, the Rambam doesn't have that problem to begin with, in my opinion. Meaning it just so happens his view of Ein Nishbayim al Kriya Shiba Karkos is such that he doesn't really have this problem. You'll have to take my word on that for now, but hold me to it when we get to that topic. Okay? But what I do want to, I'm going to stop here because it's getting late. But so let's just sum up what we've seen so far, and then we will continue next time with the whole principle of Moda B'Miktas and Kofar HaKol, the next lines of the Gemara. So, but just to sum up for today, what we've seen is that there's a difference between Kofar HaKol and Moda B'Miktas, Doraisa. Moda B'Miktas is Chai V'Shua Doraisa. Kofar HaKol is Potter. We'll analyze that next week. Then what we did focus on is Rab Chia tried to extend the chiyuv Moda B'Miktas to a chiyuv that was engendered by Edim, not just by Hodas Baldin, Piv. Not just Asher Yomar Ki Huzeh, the classic Moda B'Miktas, but even a chiyuv which is engendered by Edim, Shelo Tehei Hadas Edim, Gora Mi Hodas Piv. The simple reading of what Rab Chia did was with regard to Edim actually testifying about a Miktsas chiyuv. And even then, the Gemara later on in Hayamid Aleph records that there are those who disagreed with Rab Chia. The Balei Tosfos, the Rach, everybody discusses, do we paskin like Rab Chia, yes or no? The Rambam interprets Rab Chia as Edim directly being Machayev. That party definitely has. But he paskins like Rab Chia, kind of not, I wouldn't say begrudgingly, but with, kind of a qualification by saying, the Gonim all paskin like Rab Chia. So on that basis, we're going to paskin that way too. And I think it's telling that he repeats the reasoning of Rab Chia, which the Rambam does not often leaves that out because it's it's a book of psak. It's not, typically comprehensive in identifying the rationale behind the psak. But I think the whole point is that the Rambam saying, the Gemara isn't so clear about it. The Rabbeinu Hananel changed his mind. Okay, we're going to pass like Rabbi Chia, but based on the Gonim. But certainly, Ein L'Chabal L'Chidusha, the way that he understands it, which is that Rabbi Chia is being mechayev in a direct chiyuv mamon, and we'll see how this fits in with other Rambams a little bit later on. The Rajba, who does paskin like Rabbi Chia, on the other hand, and he impacted on the Ritva, the Ran, the Nemuka Yosef, meaning the other Chachmei Sfarad, because of the problem of Einish Boimal Kfir Shiba Karkos, which you'll take my word for the moment, the Rambam likely doesn't have, but the others do. Because of that problem, he thought that you cannot read Reb Chia according to the plain meaning. The case has to be one which is a little more indirect. Namely, it's not a case where Adim testify about a Vadai present obligation. It's where Adim contradict the contradiction of the more basic contradiction of the Love, and then you invoke the ruling of Kola Omer Lolavisi Kilom Lo Paraiti. So that the Adim don't directly, on the basis of their saying, they don't speak of his actual obligation, right? They trigger his obligation based on the principle of what we call Huchsak Kafron, based on the Adim have shown that he's lying in his first response, and lying in your first response means that you're stuck with that narrative, right? And therefore the narrative, in light of the lie, establishes a chiyuv tashlumin. But that is a giant step removed from what the Rambam understands and from what the simple pshat of the Gemara is. And nonetheless, the Rajba paskins like this expanded Reb Chia. So we want to pick up with next week. This is all to get to a better understanding of Moed Mixas and Kofar Kol and so on. Is next week we're going to discuss the next line of the Gemara, Mipnei Ma Omer Torah Moed Mixas Ataina Yeshava, a classic line in a discussion in the Gemara that appears all throughout Shas, meaning like 5 other places in Masachet Ksuvos and Bava Kama and Gittin and Shavuos and here in Bab Metzia, but very critical lines. There are 2 opposite ways to interpret the Shaklavatari of the Gemara, and that leave us with 2 opposite perspectives on what triggers a Shvuah and the relationship of Kofar HaKol and Moed B'Miktsas. That's on next week's agenda. And then we will continue the Shaklavatariya about the relationship between Hadas Edom and Hadas Piv and Reb Chia's, and the maybe expanding Reb Chia even further. Okay. All right. So that is our agenda going forward. Okay. Have a great week.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. Good night. Thank
Rabbi?
you so much.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question from someone who's unlearned? One of the things we keep missing are the details of this. We have someone who comes and says he owes me 100, and 2 witnesses who come and say, we know he owes 50. But there's nothing in the text that tells us, well, maybe the guy borrowed 50 on Monday and the guy borrowed another 50 on Friday, and the witnesses only were there for one occasion. We don't have anything in the text that says, how does the guy claim it's 100? It makes it sound like it's, well, he came and borrowed 100 at one time, and the witnesses somehow say it's only 50. I'm a little confused.
I'm not following. Let's take this case. You're talking about this exact case?
Well,
Okay.
I'm looking at this case and I'm saying,
Right.
the person says 100, the witnesses say 50.
No,
So-
but yeah, so that's I think I addressed this earlier, which is the witnesses don't say 50 but not 100. They say we are only aware of 50, and the way that we're aware of the 50 doesn't preclude that there was 100, but it doesn't mean that there was either.
Right. So what I'm saying is, why is there nothing in the text that the person who says he owes 100 says it's not one transaction, it's 2, whatever. We don't get any background. So my first thought was, well, the witnesses are telling the truth, but we don't know anything about the person making the
The
claim.
assumption is that the witnesses are always telling the truth, unless we know that they're contradicted or something else.
And what about the claimant? How do we make the assumption that he's telling the truth?
No, that's the point. Is the claimant is contradicted by the defendant. So
Uh-huh.
we are trying to navigate
Finish.
between two conflicting claims.
Actually,
Now,
it's
the witnesses will always,
It's
be
actually
believed.
finished. But somebody asked a question.
They'll always be the image will the Adam will always be believed, to separate between the two mutually exclusive claims. The problem is, let's say the Adam have information, but they don't have full information. Now, is that possible that Adam have partial but not full information? Of course. Meaning, if it was a situation where the Adam kind of came along and they said he's half right and he's half wrong, each one is 50% correct, there would be no shvua. There would just be you'd pay $50 and that would be the end of the story. But we all know that there can be situations where people see things, they see something, and what they see is important, and they can attest to it. It's very clear, but they don't see everything, either because maybe there are two transactions, like you're saying, or maybe it was one transaction, and they came in the middle, or the kind of bills, let's say there are only I don't know, only $5 bills and $10 bills in circulation, right? So they witnessed the exchange of a certain quantity of bills, but they didn't see if there were fives or tens, right? So they know that at least 50% of the claim is true. Maybe it was fives, or maybe 100% of the claim is true because maybe it was tens, right? I mean, it's not hard to envision scenarios. Well, either they walk in the middle, or there are two parts to the transaction, or what they see, is what they see is minimally relevant, but it doesn't mean that they saw enough to speak authoritatively about the whole thing. So either way, then you have these two mutually exclusive claims, but the issue in this particular case is that the defendant was saying the whole thing never happened,
Yeah.
or that I don't know a penny. So now the witnesses have enlightened us because they've told us that at least 50% of the claim is true. So Rabbi Chia is saying, well, on the 50% that they bring total enlightenment, we act on that because witnesses are always believed. But in addition to that, that spills over into the credibility or the quality of the claim. It supports not enough to impose a monetary obligation, but enough to at least demand greater clarity with an oath. Because when the witnesses came along and they said, we know for sure that at least half of this is correct, and we're not saying definitively that the other half is not correct, we just don't know. So they've done two things. They've clarified 50%. And by clarifying 50% on behalf of one of the parties when the other party denied the whole thing,
It discredited
they've
the other
also credited that fellow with more credibility. So that translates into the shvuah. Do you understand?
one. I think in this case, I do, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, it's always good to ask. Okay.
I've got a lot to learn.
A good evening and a good week, everyone. And again, these are, complicated topics, but very interesting topics, I hope.
Yasher koach.
Okay. Have a great week. Thank you so much.
Kol tov.